Right. Welcome, everybody. It's 3 o'clock here in Sweden. It's 2 o'clock in Britain. So I think it's time to get started with this webinar. So a warm welcome to this webinar about how to manage external identities using Azure AD. My name is Tom Åfloen. I'm a partner at Onevinn. That's a company who focuses on Microsoft security solutions. The AA in my last name is from my Norwegian origin, but I live and work in Karlstad, Sweden. And I've been working with IT and security for more than 23 years now. I focus mostly on Active Directory group policies, PKI certificates, identity-based things. But in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been focusing on Azure AD and all the security features that are involved there. Today's webinar is co-hosted together with Chris and Dave from Condatis. Maybe you can take over and introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to Onevinn for giving us the opportunity to help you present this. I'm Chris Eckel, I'm CTO of Condatis, and Condatis is an identity company based in the UK. And our main focus is helping customers with challenges around their consumer identities or citizen identities. We've been one of the first partners to bring this Azure Active Directory B2C to Europe and work in close collaboration with the product group over at Microsoft. Dave, do you want to take over?
Yep, I'm Dave. I'm one of the senior developers at Condatis. I've been working in the Microsoft space for about 15 years and more recently specializing in B2C for providing identity access management solutions, delivering those to our clients.
Great. So a quick look at today's agenda then on a high level. First, we're going to talk about Azure AD B2B, the business-to-business feature. Then Condatis is going to take over and talk about Azure AD B2C and how they relate to each other. And then we can give you some tips on next steps. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session. And please use the built-in Q&A feature in this meeting to ask your questions. And we will try to answer them at the end of this webinar. Great. So Azure AD business to business. Let's start with a background on external collaboration. How do we do collaboration with external identities or partners without Azure AD B2B? Here we have an example scenario. I have a user in my company who has some sort of data he wants to share with user B in another company. So the by far most common solution for this is that we create an account in our tenant for user B. That means that user B gets another set of credentials, a username and a password for my tenant. He can then use that account to access the information. But there are some negative things about this. The user needs to remember another set of credentials. And also there's no link between those accounts. Which means that if user B quits at that company and no longer should have access to those things, he still has an account in my company. So there's a risk of lingering permissions here. Another solution for sharing with partners is that you actually send the information over to the company. And then the user can use his regular username and password and access the information, which is user-friendly for him. But here we don't have control over the data anymore. So the data can go anywhere. There are solutions for managing this as well. Microsoft Information Protection is one. But another problem is what happens if you have an application in your tenant and you want to give user B access to that. Then this solution doesn't work either. So introducing Azure AD B2B. How does that work? Well, same scenario, no difference there. But instead of creating an account in my tenant, I actually send an invitation to that user. And that invitation creates a sort of a representation or a placeholder or a stub account, you can call it what you will, that represents that user in my tenant. And we can then use this representation of an account to give access to things. But the authentication part still happens at the other end of the scenario here. The user uses his existing credentials to sign in. So then we have solved the issue that when that user quits his company, he can no longer access things because the authentication no longer works. So that doesn't give us a lot of accounts that shouldn't have access anymore. So this is an overview of how it looks. So how do we get those users invited then? Well, there's different ways you can do that. First of all, the end users in your tenant can be made available to do this if they want to, and they can do it in the applications they use every day in Teams or groups, or even in the Office client, if you will. You can also have other SaaS applications where you can invite guest users, and more are coming. If you're an admin, you can also create these invites. You can do it from the Azure portal. You can also do it through PowerShell or Graph API if you want to do it more in batch script scenarios. There's also a preview right now in Azure AD B2B where you can have self-service sign up, where you create a user flow and you associate that flow to your application. And those who visits that application can then actually sign up as a guest in your tenant for that application. But this right now only works for your own custom application. It doesn't work for Microsoft apps or third-party apps. So the most common is that the user or the admin actually does the invitations. So what type of accounts can we then invite into our tenant using B2B? Well, if the other one is using an Azure AD account or an Office 365 account, which a lot of people do, it just works straight out of the box, no problem. The same goes for Microsoft personal accounts, the Live ID, the Hotmail, the Outlook.com accounts. That works also straight out of the box. If you're inviting a Gmail address, you need to set up a Google federation in your tenant for that to work natively, which means that they can authenticate with their existing Gmail account. This is super easy, takes just a few minutes. I'm going to cover that a little more later in the presentation. You can also set up direct federation from your tenant to any other identity provider using SAML or VS-Fed. That means that they can authenticate using the external IDP as a guest user into your tenant. This is common in mergers and acquisitions. It's also used in some hybrid scenarios together with B2C that we will cover later. If the invited user doesn't have any one of these scenarios, there is a one-time passcode feature they can use to authenticate. That basically means you send a one-time code to the email to make sure that the user still has control over that email box, and he uses that to sign in. Then there's no separate passwords. Today, this needs to be enabled by an admin, but it's going to be default turned on for all tenants in the future. So this is the sort of catch-all scenario, so you can invite any user. If you haven't turned on this enable one-time password email, it's still possible to invite anyone. We have a more complex user flow here, where the top is the one we talked about, but the bottom here, if you don't use the one-time password yet, Azure AD B2B will actually try to create an account for the invited user with the email that you invited him for. Either a Azure AD or a Microsoft account. Then that user needs to keep track of that password to access your information. So that's not the best solution, but it is possible. We're not blocked from inviting any type of recipient. And that partner is invited. He's just like any other user in Azure AD, basically. And you can give him access to applications and information. And you can also add that guest user in groups if you want to. And you have a lot of security features as well. You can have conditional access, MFA, identity protection, a lot of different stuff also works for your guest users. So I thought we'd take 2 demos here where we try to invite users. We have one from an admin point of view, and we also have another one for an end user point of view. So a little setup. We have 2 internal users. We have John, who is an admin in our tenant. And we also have Maria, who's a project manager. And we want to invite 2 different types of users. We have an external vendor that uses Azure AD already. And we also have another user, Tim, who uses Gmail, just to see the difference here. First thing John does is that he enables the Google federation that I mentioned earlier. This is super simple. You basically create the Google account. And there in Google, you register an application and create a client secret for free. Then you enter this client ID and the secret in Azure AD, and bam, you're done. Now you can use Google as a federated identity in your tenant. What he also does, John, before, is that he uses conditional access to insert a terms of use for all guest users. This is in no way needed or necessary. I just want to show you that this is a good scenario that you can use when you invite users, but you don't have to use these terms of use. So he goes to the user pane, and he, instead of creating a new user, he clicks on invite user. This is the B2B. And then he fills out the information, which basically only needs to be an email address. We can enter a name if we want to. We can also include a personal message if we want to. And then we click invite. This creates this representation or stub account in the Azure AD tenant right away when you click invite here. So we can start giving access to things to that representation of an account. So what happens for the end user then? Here we are from Emma's point of view. She receives an email saying, you've been invited to this organization by this user, and here is the custom message if we have one. And by clicking on get started, and remember she uses Azure AD already, so she are automatically single sign on to this. What happens here is that the first time when you sign in as a guest user to a tenant, you need to consent that this is okay. And the things you consent to is to sign in and read name and email and photo. That's it, nothing else. And just a quick side note here, Microsoft strongly recommends you to turn off user consent, because that is being used in active attacks, trying to trick users to give away more permissions than they realize. So please disable user consent. This is not affected if you disable user consent. People can still consent to this specific guest user feature. Then she triggers the conditional access rule because you're an external user. So she is asked to approve these terms of use. Basically what's happening the first time they sign in is they are prompted to look at a PDF, and if they approve, they click approve. This only happens at first sign in. Optional. Also, in this tenant, we require MFA for all guest users, so she is prompted to enroll for MFA. And this is an MFA enrollment in our tenant, right? She needs to have MFA in our tenant that we control. She may have MFA on her account in her existing tenant. We don't know that. So since we don't know that, or if it's not even an Azure AD, maybe Gmail or something else, we will require MFA in our tenant. So she needs to download the app, set up it, scan the QR code. She clicks on next to try it out. And if that succeeds, then she can again just click done. So it's pretty quick to set up MFA, as we all know. And the terms of use and the MFA is only for the first time sign in. And then she's redirected to the so-called My Applications, My Apps page. This is sort of the starting page for Azure AD application. And since she was invited from the portal, she ends up here, which is sort of the starting points for guest users, if nothing else is specified. So super easy. Let's try the second one. We have Maria, who's not an admin. She is a project manager, and she is using Teams, and she would like to invite an external user who is using Gmail. She goes to add member and adds that username she wants to add. And if this feature is turned on in your tenant, an email is sent to that user. And here you see the email is similar to the one sent before. If he was to click here, when he's signed into Gmail on the web, he will be automatically single sign-on as well. But let's say he's using a mail application for his Gmail. When he clicks on the link, then he's going to need to sign in. I'm using in private here to show that. But remember, no new account is needed. He's using his existing Gmail account, existing password. Here, it's exactly the same. He needs to look at the terms of use. He also needs to sign up for MFA. There's no difference in that flow here. Just going to speed through it. But when he's done with this for the first sign in, he clicks done. He is instead going directly to Teams, the team that he was invited to. So he's not redirected to the My Apps portal because he was invited in Teams. He's going to end up straight into Teams. So that was a short demo. Who in your tenant can actually invite guest users? Well, we configure that in the Azure AD portal, and you can see the setting here. Admin and the guest inviter admin role is the first setting. There is an admin role that's called guest inviter, and people in that role can invite guest users if this is first one is set to yes. The second one is that all members in your tenant can invite, and the third one is that guests themselves can invite additional guests. This is a default setting. If you want to have a controlled rollout of B2B, you can say no to the members and you can add more and more users to the guest inviter role until you feel comfortable to rolling it out to all users. This is also where you enable the one-time password and the self-service sign-up I mentioned. And I also want to point out that you can actually control which domains, email domains, that you allow or deny as guests in your tenant. By default, you can allow any domain, but you can also choose to deny specific or allow specific tenants if you want to. That can increase security, but it can also increase the administrative burden, right? So this is how you control it for users. What if you have an application or a script that wants to invite users? Well, then you're going to use an app registration, a service principal. You're not going to run your scripts using a service account, right? A user account, right? Then you can delegate some permission to that service principal in the Microsoft Graph called user invite all. Any application with that permission is allowed to invite users to that tenant. So how can you tell which users in your tenant are guests? Well, if we just look at the user list here, we can see, user type guest, this must be it, right? Those people are actually B2B users. That's not entirely true. If we, for instance, look at this user is synced from local AD through Azure AD Connect up to our AD, and I have converted his user type to guest. So this is not a B2B user, but it is a guest, right? So you can actually switch users from guest to member. You can also take an invited B2B user and make him a full-worthy member if you would like to. So just keep track of that. What you can do is you can filter and choose, okay, show me all that has an accepted invitation or everyone who has a pending acceptance. They're invited but haven't accepted the invitation yet. There you can see who's actually a B2B user. I also want to highlight this one here, invited user. You can see the other one has sources like external Azure AD, Microsoft account, OTP, Google. This one is invited, but Azure AD haven't redeemed that invitation yet. So he doesn't know what type of account is actually behind that email address. So that explains that source type. What kind of permission then does a guest user get in your tenant? I said earlier that guests are just like any other user in your tenant, but that's not really true. Guest users are limited. Earlier, the limitation was that, for instance, they couldn't browse your users or groups. However, they could see their own user account, and they could see which groups that user account was member of. And they can see those groups and see the members in those groups and their groups and so on. So he could click himself through the tenant to get more information, but not browse. To prevent this clicking and discovering, Microsoft has a preview right now called the guest user access restriction. Here you can configure what type of access your guest users should have. The middle one is the default, limited access. You can click but not browse. If you set the top one, they will have full access just as members, or the bottom one, which is the new one, then you can restrict so the guest user can only look at things that is actually assigned to him. There is a documentation page where you can see exactly the permission and all of this. I'm not going to go through them, but everything is documented really well. So this is good to look into this if you want to restrict guest users even more. Licenses. What licenses are required for guest users? Well, it used to be 1 to 5. This is a ratio. For every licensed user in your tenant, you were allowed to invite up to 5 new guests. That doesn't mean that you can have only 5 guests per user. It's just overall that factor needs to be. So one user can invite 100 guests, but it can't be more than 5 times the number of licensed users. This is the old B2B model. The new B2B model is that they're giving it away for free up to a certain amount. They are giving you 50,000 guest users for free. That's amazing. If you're having less than 50,000 external identities, you don't have to pay a dime. And it also includes P1 and P2 features. You can have really advanced Azure AD features for these guests for free. It doesn't include like Office and SharePoint and so on. It's Azure AD, but still. It's based on monthly active users, so inactive guest users aren't counted either. You don't have to pay anything up front like the old version. You had to have the licenses beforehand. Now you just pay what you use above 50,000, right? And also remember, this is B2B guest accounts and B2C accounts as well, so it's a sum of these. When they released this new, a lot of people said, oh, that's nice. I'm just going to invite all my employees as guests. They were going to get all the premium features for free. Well, we need to talk about what a definition of a guest is in this license context. It is not a technical thing. It doesn't matter if you're synced, invited, member, guest in the tenant. It is your organizational relationship in real life. If you're an employee of the company, you cannot use these free guest accounts. If you are a member of a company that is owned by at least 50%, you cannot use this. So if you are part of the same conglomerate, as Microsoft says, you need to have a full license. But if not, you will get 50,000 guest users for free. To switch this licensing model, you need to link an Azure AD subscription, an Azure subscription, so that if you overstep these 50,000, there needs to be a way to pay for it. You just simply go into external identities, click on linked subscription, and you link a subscription here. But for many companies, it's really unlikely that you actually go over 50,000. But that depends on your business. What happens if we go beyond 50,000 then? Well, it's going to cost you, but not a lot. For Swedish, it's going to cost you less than 3 öre for every monthly active users for a premium one feature. And in Britain, it's going to cost you a quarter of a penny for each new user per month. So it's really inexpensive, even if you happen to step over 50,000. Again, these are list prices. I found them on the web. Talk to your license account guy to get prices that's specific for you. I cannot promise you any prices, unfortunately. Right, so to summarize then, what are the benefits of the Azure AD B2B collaboration? Well, you can invite any user. Doesn't matter. You don't need to know what type of account or what's going on behind. Just invite anyone through their email address. You get single sign-on. I typed it times twice because they can use their existing account to access your tenant. That's a single sign-on. But you can also give him access to different applications in your tenant. And as long as those are Azure AD integrated, he's going to get single sign-on to them as well. You can access any app, and you can also even access on-premises applications here. It requires you to sync the guest accounts down to your local AD, but then you can also give access to AD applications or SAML applications that is running on premises. And Azure AD can actually convert that Azure AD token the guest user gets to a Kerberos token, so you can access things in the local AD. You get security, you do get conditional access, and you get MFA, logging, and so on. If you have governance, cleaning up your user accounts and doing access reviews and things like that, you can include that as well in the B2B. I see the heading is 5 benefits, but here comes the 6th one. You don't need to manage passwords anymore. And I think that's a really good feature. Right, that was if you're managing your partner accounts. What happens if you want to manage your customer accounts instead? For that, I'm going to hand over to Chris. Can you perhaps share your screen?
Thanks, Tom. And hopefully you're seeing my screen now. Okay, so thanks for outlining how B2B helps companies manage access to resources. My part is how AAD secures, we see how AAD secures internal services, and B2B extends these internal services to partners via invites to their AAD tenants or any account, as we heard. Now, on the consumer side, the other side, the external enterprise services that are aimed at companies, customers, consumers. B2C is the service that enables that. So all the customer-facing services are secured with B2C, and B2C is also has a lot of scenarios where it is B2B-like features, and we'll see that in the demo in a second. Azure Active Directory B2C, it allows you to bring all the identities that those consumers, customers, citizens are already using and connect them to the business, making it easier and more secure. It allows securely authenticating any kind of users, but with a fully customizable experience. And access the data in Azure Active Directory B2C to better understand your customer. The connection between the business and the application is done via what's called policy framework. So what is this flexible policy framework? It's a configurable set of instructions that controls the user experience as they interact with the identity system with B2C. It controls the information collected from the user and what's stored in the directory, and what claims and attributes are returned back to the application. There are two flavors. The first one is what's called built-in policies. Built-in policies are like a set of ready-made templates that cover the most common identity flows. And they can be used in web or in mobile applications. For example, there's a template for sign up, for sign in, to edit a profile, a user profile, or to reset password. We also know that there are many more complex scenarios, very specific requirements out there, and that's why there are custom policies. They allow to design your own set of instructions for the identity experience framework. And that's the engine that runs B2C. Imagine you need to connect to another internal system to validate a claim before allowing the user to complete a sign-up. Or you have an existing user store. You may need to authenticate against this existing store, or even do a just-in-time migration of those users to B2C during the sign-in flow. So it's really transparent to the user. Maybe you need to perform a check to see if the user has agreed to new terms and conditions, or collect consent from the user. Custom policy gives you all the power and flexibility to implement whatever you can imagine, whatever the business problem is. And custom policy and built-in policies can coexist. You might decide to have a custom policy for the sign-up flow, but use the built-in policy for password reset. To see how this looks in practice, Dave has a few examples and walkthroughs for us. Over to you, Dave.
Cool, let me get this up on the screen. So yeah, so we talked about the fact that B2C is configured through policies and it's very configurable. What we're going to do here with the demo is just walk through really a fairly basic sign in and sign up flow for an application that wants to allow our members of staff and our customers both to sign in. So we're going to do some home run discovery, determining whether the user is a customer or a member of staff. If they're a member of staff, we want them to sign in using Azure Active Directory. If they're a customer, we're going to create a local B2C account. And peppered in amongst that, we're going to do some audit logging of what types of logins are occurring and some requests to our CRM to create contact details. So, where do we start? It usually starts with a user coming along to what we call a relying party application. This is some application or service that lives outside of B2C that we or the client have written that provides something to their customers. So it might be a support portal, it might be something that provides them with custom reports, or even something like providing them access to their account details for an e-commerce website. All of those things need securing, and we'd use a system like B2C to secure them, federating the authentication using something like OpenID Connect or SAML. So here, our relying party application, which lives outside B2C, when we click the sign in, it's going to take us over to B2C. B2C is going to do its sign in logic and then bring us back to the app with a token with some user details in, so the app knows, okay, this user's authenticated, and we're just going to show some details about what that means. So our user clicks sign in, the site redirects to B2C, to the B2C policy engine. Now, we talked about there being policies and there being a number of different policies. Part of what our relying party sends when we make that initial sign-in request is the name of the policy that we want to execute. So in this case, we're doing a sign-in, so we want it to execute the sign-in policy. B2C knows how to take that policy and then run the different steps in it. So in our case, it looks at the first step in the policy, which is show the home run discovery page, and it redirects to a home run discovery page. Now this page looks exactly like the page we were just on. It's branded in exactly the same way, but it's inside B2C, whereas our service was outside B2C. And that's done through HTML templates that you can request B2C use. So you can set up a HTML template with your custom branding on and have your authentication journey in B2C be branded exactly the same as your relying party branding, so the user gets a seamless journey all the way through. They don't need to know that they're going off to this external service to do the actual sign-in. So on our home run discovery, first thing we want to do is capture their email address, because we want to know what type of user they are. So we enter their email address. Here I'm entering my company email address because I'm a staff member who wants to sign in. I click continue, and that gets sent over by the page back to the policy engine. Now the policy engine already knows which policy it's executing the sign-in one, and it knows that after the home run discovery step, it's got a decision to make. Am I a staff member who should be redirected to the federated sign-in, or am I a customer who needs to go through the local sign-in and registration flow? Based on my email address and the logic that we've added to the policy, it knows that it needs to do a federated sign-in. So it's going to redirect me over to my AAD. So like our relying party app redirected to B2C, and we were executing logic in B2C, we've now redirected over to my AAD, and all of my sign-in logic's happening there. I'm going to go through whatever steps my admin's configured. So in this case, username and password, but that might be MFA, it might be, do you want to stay signed in? All of that great stuff that comes with AAD. The important part is at the end of it, AAD is going to return a token back to B2C. We're going to be sent back to B2C. And the policy engine is going to kick in again and go, okay, after the user comes back from AAD, what do I need to do? What's the next step that we've configured? Well, fairly obviously, it's validating the token. We want to make sure that the token issued by AAD hasn't been tampered with, that it was issued by the AAD we expect, that it was for B2C, etc. Second thing we want to do, according to our policy, is we want to log the fact that the user's just been authenticated. So B2C's verified the fact that the users come back from AAD fine with a valid token, so we want to log that somewhere. B2C has its own internal logging, so that all goes into its logging repository. That can be hooked up into various different places. But what we want to do here is we want to add some logging on top of that. So we're having the policy make an API call. That API call can go to anywhere we want it to go because it's just an API call that we've written. So it might go to Cosmos DB, Service Bus, App Insights, Event Hub, SQL Server, wherever you want it to go. All B2C is concerned about is we've made an API call there. We've sent over whatever information we wanted. In our case, maybe just a federated authentication occurred, and that API then is responsible for doing, whatever it needs to do so it fits into your logging system. So once we validate the token we've got, We've logged that an authentication's occurred, so all that's left is for B2C to create its own token to return back to the relying party, which in our case, all we're going to do with the relying party is just show that that token was returned with the information that was returned in it. So in our case, we're returning an email address, given name, surname, and their full name, along with some other information about the user and about how they authenticated. In reality, the relying party is probably going to do something different with this. It's going to give them access to whatever it needs to give them access to. We've used it, you can see in the top right, just to do a little bit of personalization, just to say hello and then use the given name. But at this point, our relying party, our service, our external service has got that token. It's authenticated the user, it's verified that that token is valid, and the user can do whatever they need to in our app. So that's let a staff member in. That's federated a request off to AAD and signed a user in that way. What if we want to use a login that's built into B2C? Well, we'd still need to click a sign in from a fresh copy of our application. That's still going to take us to the home realm discovery as the first step. But this time when we enter, say, a Gmail address, that's going to be posted to B2C. B2C still got the same decision to make, but because it knows, based on the logic that we've configured in our policy, that that's not one of our company email addresses, it knows to do the local sign-in. So we redirect to a page still within B2C that you'll recognize as a much more standard, email and password sign-in page with a link to register. If you've got social accounts, if you want to do Google and Facebook sign-in, that might also appear on this page. This is, your traditional sign-in, sign-up flow. Now, my user here doesn't have an account yet, so we want to do a sign-up. So we're going to click the Sign Up Now link, which again just sends another message to the policy engine, which looks at our policy and says, OK, once that link's been clicked, what do I need to do? Well, in our case, we want to show a sign-up page. So that redirects us to the sign-up page, again, still in B2C, and there's a lot going on this page, so we'll break it down into a few parts. So the very first thing is that we want to make sure that the users registering for our service aren't just typing in spammy email addresses. We want to send them a one-time passcode to that email address that they then have to enter to prove that they have access to that email inbox. So when I send the verification code, the page is going to make an AJAX request to B2C, which is going to send me an email. And there's different ways that B2C can do that depending on the level of customization you need. You can just drop a control on and it'll send one using kind of standard AAD branding, or you can get a bit more complicated and do a fully branded email. So it's got all of your branding, custom wording, the lot. Once I've got my email, I enter my one-time passcode in the verify code. I click verify, it makes another AJAX call back to B2C to verify the code that I've entered matches the one from my email. Now B2C handles all of that for me. Even if I want to do the fully branded email template, all I have to do is set up the control and stick it on the page. It's going to handle retries, it's going to handle entering the wrong passcode and validation, what happens if the email needs resending. All of that comes kind of built in, so you can just say, I want this to happen as part of my policy. Assuming I've entered the correct code, which I have here, I can then fill in the rest of the form. You'll see we've got a bunch of different fields on here. We've got the usual, password, re-enter password, first name, last name, and we've got this where did you hear about us. That's all going to be sent over to our policy, to the policy engine. We've defined in that policy all of these fields on the page and everything that's being sent back. We've also defined all the validation that's running. So we've defined, for example, the minimum password strength, the fact that we've got these two password fields and we're doing cross-validation to make sure the user's definitely entering the password correctly, the fact that first name and last name are both required. Because that's all defined in the policy, so B2C knows about it, it can run all of that validation client side for a good user experience, but it also runs it on the back end when we submit the form to make sure that the user is actually submitting correct data. If they're not, as with a standard web page, it just redisplays the form with any errors, the user fixes them and continues. So once we've submitted the valid information, again, it's just looking at the policy for what happens next in the registration flow. Well, the first thing we want to do is create the user record in the Active Directory that backs B2C. So B2C has this policy engine that it's executing our logic on, but it's also got an Active Directory that it can store the user records in. So we create the user record in there. We store all of the standard fields that we're capturing, so email address, password, first name and last name, all of which come with the AAD user record. But we're also storing this "where did you hear about us" field, this referrer field. All we've done there is create an extension field on the user record, and then B2C knows how to create that extension field if it doesn't exist, read it and write it. We don't have to worry about doing any of that. All we say to B2C is we want to deal with that particular field on this particular page. So we create the user record. The next thing we might want to do is create a contact in our CRM. Maybe we want to create a full contact record. So maybe we want to provide support in the future, so we record the full thing, or we want to do marketing information. Maybe we just want to capture what the referrer is, where the user heard about us, so that we can feed that through into BI systems and then analyze marketing spend and things like that. All we're doing here with B2C, with the policy, is the same thing we were doing when we were logging the fact that an authentication had occurred. We're just making an API call to create a CRM contact with whatever information we want to provide. That API call can then be responsible for creating that record in Salesforce or in Dynamics or SQL, wherever you want it to go. All B2C is concerned about, again, is interacting with that API call. So we've created a user record, we've created the contact. So again, we want to log that an authentication's occurred. It's a user registration, but it's still a type of authentication. It's probably got a different message to our federated one. Maybe we want to record it as a registration, but we're still authenticating the fact that this is a user who's now able to use our end system that we're trying to authenticate. So we log the fact that the authentication's occurred, and then again, we just create a token based on that user's details and send it back to our relying party. And again, we go back to the relying party, and again, our relying party here is just showing us that token that got returned, the information in it. You can see we've included a referrer, which is the referrer that we captured during registration. We don't have to, that's completely configurable, but we're just showing it here as something that gets passed along the process. So just to cap it off, if I wanted to do a sign in, assuming I go through my home realm discovery again with my Gmail address, so I'm going to the local sign in and sign up page, I enter my email address, I enter my password, I click sign in. That again just gets sent back to the policy engine, and again we're just executing steps in the policy. So the first one might be authenticate the user against the directory. So we created them during registration, so now we can just query the directory to see whether that user exists with that password. And once we've done that, we can read any additional details. So we've got that extension field, that referrer field, that's not built into the AAD record. It doesn't come with it initially, so it's not going to be returned by an authenticate call. So we just make an additional read to get that back. We then again log the authentication exactly the same way. Maybe we log it as a sign-in's happened, and again we just create a token and issue it to the relying party, and we're back in our app fully authenticated with exactly the same token here as we had during our registration. We could customize it, but generally registration and sign-in probably want the same claims. So the important thing to take away from all of that is that the logic we run, the logic that the policy engine executes, is completely defined by the custom policies that we write. The steps that we executed there, the order that we executed them in, were entirely defined by us. They're not prescribed by B2C. We could change the order of these steps around, like we're seeing on the sign-in page. So we could, if we wanted to, log that an authentication's occurred before we even authenticate the user. I don't know why you would, but it's possible. We could do any other steps in here. So if we wanted to read from the CRM, maybe we want to read some supplemental permissions information or check whether they've got access to a particular service, we could stick an API call in here anywhere to read that information back prior to creating the token. It's all completely configurable. And that just shows really a fairly straightforward sign-in journey. B2C with the policies is capable of much, much more than that. So we showed some customized branding there so that B2C is styled exactly the same as the relying party. The user doesn't have to feel like they're leaving one site and going to another. but you can completely customize that branding. You could have it so that it's different for different types of user, or so it's different coming from different relying parties. If you've got different services that are branded slightly differently, you could still use B2C as one common source for how the user authenticates, still potentially use the same policy for authenticating them both, but have them both be branded differently depending where the user's coming from. You can also include JavaScript on the page. So if we wanted to have, say, a custom password strength indicator on the registration page, we just stick some JavaScript on the page and B2C will execute that with no problems at all. It supports multiple authentication methods. So we showed there authenticating both with the home realm discovery and then sending a user off to AAD. We also talked a bit about the social logins. So Google, Facebook, you could add Twitter, LinkedIn, really any OAuth or SAML integration you want to add, B2C will support in pretty much any way that you want to do it. It also supports OpenID Connect and SAML for talking to relying parties. So our relying party there was using OpenID Connect, but we could equally have used SAML, and we could use the same journey logic for both and just have policies that customize what protocol we're using to communicate with those policies. The policies themselves, like we said, they can do pretty much anything that you could want them to do. So we showed a sign in and sign up one there, but you could have policies. If you've got social accounts, you might want users to be able to link multiple social accounts to their same user account. So I could sign in with either Facebook or Google or a username and password and have it still be linked to the same user record in our system, and then unlink those if I ever leave Google or Facebook for some reason. We're registering users, so you might want to do user profile management, which could be self-service password reset, forgot password, changing your email address or any of your details. Progressive profiling is something that comes up occasionally, so you might want a very low friction registration process where you want to let as many people as possible in to register with as little requirement from them as possible. So maybe all you want to do is capture their email address during registration, maybe a password, and then just let them in. And then the next time they sign in, you prompt them for additional information. You say, okay, now we're going to show you a screen where we ask you to enter your full name and surname. Maybe if they've been a member of the system for a while, or if they've done a certain number of logins, then we prompt them for more information. So tell us about your company or how you're finding the system, that kind of thing. You can have your policies set up so that you don't have to prompt them for everything straight away. That's where terms of service and updates come in as well. So if you prompt them during registration for to agree to a set of terms of service, you could later on update those terms of service and use part of your sign-in policy to re-prompt them to re-agree to the new terms of service. And then another thing that we see quite often is rights elevation. If you've got a particular section of your site that needs to be more secure, then assuming your user's already signed in, you might want to prompt them for some more information, like a one-time passcode via SMS or answer some security questions about yourself. You could have a policy that assumes the user signed in and just prompts for that information and then returns a token that says, okay, the user's provided that information, and your site can go, right, well, I'll let them access this more secure area of the site. So you're elevating the rights of an already signed in user. And then finally, the thing that a lot of people want, I think pretty much everyone wants, is if you've got an existing store of users, you can migrate them all into B2C either in bulk ahead of time using Graph API, or because you can customize your policies, you can do it just in time. So you could have your sign-in policy, make an API call to a legacy system, check that a username and password matches the legacy system, and if it does, it just ports that user over into B2C, it writes them out into its directory, marks them as migrated, and then it never needs to do it again. You've got a lot of flexibility around what you can do there. And that's it. I don't know whether, Chris, you wanted to kind of take a wider view of other things that you can do with B2C.
Thanks, Dave. I hope this is a really detailed walkthrough, and you see B2C is so customizable, and it's really this engine. It's abstracting the authentication of the enterprise service, the relying party application, and the underlying systems that the enterprise uses to manage their customers. So for the relying party application, it's just a call to an identity provider as before, but the possibilities B2C has to call social social identity providers or APIs or directories or CRM systems in any numbers of steps. And each of these steps can be conditional on data gained by previous steps. So you can make decisions whether you do this or not. Whatever is needed for the journey, fully customizable. And as you've also seen, is it's fully in the brand of the application. So you don't see any Microsoft domains or anything. It's fully under your control. To give the full picture of what's possible, I have two short case studies where we've used it. So one is Nuffield Health, who are a private healthcare provider in the UK. They have around 70,000 customers. The other is the UK Hydrographic Office, who are a government department, who are tasked with maritime data collection and its reuse, really, and mainly commercially. Nuffield, customer of ours since 2016, they had a lot of different shop windows, siloed identity provisioning. They have hundreds of gyms, 20-odd hospitals, and they didn't have a single consistent access point for their users. So they had a strategy to consolidate identity, to bring in CRM integration, and we helped them through that process. Now Nuffield has a Nuffield Health account for every customer. That account is connected to Salesforce. It has two levels of authentication, so it has this rights elevation that Dave spoke about, and it'll soon allow Nuffield customers to use their Nuffield account to use Wi-Fi guest login in gyms and hospitals. So multi-use, always capture where your customer is. Nuffield were actually the first B2C implementation in the UK. That they were part of the private preview that Microsoft run, and successfully still like it. And their connection is to Salesforce, so it doesn't need to be CRM or Dynamics. It can be any CRM solution you have to manage your customer. The other example is the UK Hydrographic Office. We deal with them for 2 years now. They're the agency that provides hydrographic and maritime geospatial data to miners and maritime organizations. And we got recommended to them to deal with them and have helped them to really integrate and simplify it. Initially, it was the existing mapping portal. That was an off-the-shelf software product that's using SAML, and we integrated B2C in there. We helped them also to secure their customer-facing data APIs, so tidal data and things like that you can get from them. And we put B2C as an authentication layer on top of Azure API Manager. And all of this under the UKHO brand, so fully transparent to the customer that it's B2C. We helped the UI team also to understand this. Their service is really not dependent of third-party system providers. It's all their one digital service experience. All their customers are linked to a Dynamics 365 that holds the customer. So B2C is the authentication. Dynamics 365 is the master record for the customers. And they have so much confidence now that they're even planning now to connect mission-critical systems like SOLAS, which is safety of life at seas, to the B2C authentication. So as a takeaway and summary of B2C, B2C, B2B, B2C has a bit of a naming problem, because B2C can do so much more than just the consumer identity, as we've seen in Dave's walkthrough. You can log in anybody that's connected to any federated system as well. And depending on your use case, building a hybrid solution is quite often a good approach if you need to do this. It's an engine that allows you to fully bespoke that business problem and solve that business problem of identity in an easy way. Over to Olaf, and thanks for the time.
Well, thank you very much for that. Hope you can hear me as well. It's time now for some questions, and if you need any help regarding this or more information, feel free to contact me or Wilf if you want to with the contact information below, because we like to help you further on this journey with the external and internal identities. And see if we have if you have any questions that you haven't already posted in the chat, please do so now and we will answer them as well.
We got one question regarding Facebook and B2B, and
Yeah.
you can, I answered it and I'll also tell you about it. You can use Facebook as an identity provider for the self-service sign-up user flow that only works for your custom applications. You cannot use Facebook as an identity provider for regular B2B invitations, unfortunately. But in B2C, it's fully supported. And I posted a link as well with more information.
Yeah, Facebook is an identity provider like Google that can be used as a federated identity provider in B2C. B2C, not sure if it came across, there's two types of identity. One is the local account where the user has a username and password and they can really use any email address as the identifier for the user. And then they can create a password on top of that. So that's bringing the identity in-house and the user needs to remember a new password, but that's quite often companies do that. Or you can allow the user to bring their own identity. So something they already know, they know their Facebook username password. So we federate out to Facebook, you log in Facebook. We don't know how secure your Facebook account and password is. So quite often a company then wants to do MFA on top of it, and you can easily configure that in B2C. And then you have a user, the user doesn't need to remember a new password, they can just reuse the logged in status of Facebook.
Yeah, the important thing with B2C there, I guess, is that because it's all controlled by the policies, you can do any logic you want to around the actual federate off to Facebook. So like Chris says, you could do MFA after the fact. If you detect that a certain set of users are coming from a certain place, you could only do it for Facebook, or you could only do it for Google, or whatever logic you need that to be. It's all completely configurable in the policies.
Yes,
if anyone wants to
be able to keep our time, I think we need to wrap it up here. And what you're going to say, Tom?
I just wanted to add that you can go to the Swedish site filmstaden.se if you want to try the B2C in real life. Just go to filmstaden.se and try to sign up for an account, and that they are actually using B2C, but it's not super apparent because the branding is so good. So that's the one way to test this.
And for the UK guys, go to Nuffield Health. On their website, top right, you can sign up free for Nuffield Health's account. Doesn't commit to anything, but you see B2C in action.
Right, it's 4 o'clock.
Super. Yeah, thank you very much for attending, everyone. And I will stop recording, and feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.